Hi, and welcome to the 17th Annual Food Justice Summit. My name is Enrique Orozco, and I am one of the co-organizers of the summit this year. Before we start your session, I want to highlight some of the accessibility options, engagement features, and explain how to access interpretation services. Hola, y bienvenido a la 17ª Cumbre Anual de la Justicia Alimentaria de Chicago. Me llamo Enrique Orozco y soy uno de los coordinadores de la cumbre este año. Antes de empezar, quiero tomar un momento para indicar las opciones de accesibilidad, las herramientas de participación y los servicios de interpretación. Para acceder a los servicios de interpretación, fíjese al lado derecho de su pantalla. Al hacer clic en la pestaña de interpretación, se abrirá una ventana. Haga clic en Select y luego elija el lenguaje de su preferencia, inglés o español. Seguidamente, haga clic en Connect para comenzar a escuchar al intérprete. Finalmente, debería silenciar el video principal para no escuchar a los presentadores e intérpretes. To access interpretation services, look at the right side of your screen. By clicking on the Interpretation tab, you will open a box, click on Select, and then choose which language you would like to hear, English or Spanish. Then, click on Connect to begin hearing the interpreter. Finally, you will need to mute the main video to not hear the speakers and interpreters. The platform also offers a number of visual accessibility tools. To find them, click on the profile image at the bottom right of the screen, then select Accessibility Adjustments. You can also change the language of your screen. You can select different options to make the website easier to read. We welcome you to participate in the conversation through the chat window. Clicking again on the Chat tab on the right of your screen will open up this window. Select the box at the bottom of the page to begin typing into the chat. At the end of the session, we will open for a brief question and answer portion, and you may type your questions here. Finally, at the end, I invite you to open the polling tab on the right side of your screen to answer this short survey that lets our team know how well we did in planning this session. I hope you enjoy the 17th Annual Chicago Food Justice Summit. I will now turn it over to your speakers.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Peace and greetings. My name is Asif Wilson, and I will be with you in this community for the next about 45 minutes as we discuss what I've titled today's presentation, Creating and Maintaining Healing-Centered Collective Care in Hostile Times. I think if we don't get anything out of this, we certainly get what hostile times is, right? Or are. Because I think in this moment, we're actually in the multiple moments that we sit in. All of us as human beings who are nested in a number of ecosystems or systems or structures, you might refer to them as, we experience those things. And oftentimes, unfortunately, given the state of the world today, those things can be harmful. And we hold on to that harm. And so I want to get into the other part of the title today, not so much the harm. We'll briefly touch that, but I really want to get into what we can do about it. And I'm intentional by saying we and not what you can do about it, because I really want to get us into this collective spirit today. So I hope everybody's doing well. Just before I start there, I just want to offer a trigger warning. I will be talking about white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy as harmful systems today. This might bring up some feelings, some experiences for us. I want to encourage folks to take the space that you need, to move at the speed that you need to move at, and to move in and out of this session in ways that maintain our safety, but also push us towards vulnerability. And so I offer that before I start. I also got a potty mouth, So I'm sorry. I'm gonna try to keep the cursing to a low, but I'm fired up, so it might come out. So I'm sorry ahead of time if that offends anybody. If it does, let me know, and I'll try to be mindful of my language this afternoon for the next 40 or so minutes now. Again, I want to talk more specifically about the inextricable boundedness we have to each other, the world as a site of oppression, and then this concept of healing-centered collective care that I've been studying, thinking about, actualizing in my own professional and scholarly worlds, and in my personal life for the last several years, and share that knowledge with y'all. And so I want to start with this poem, which ironically has just been banned from some classrooms on the West Coast and the Southwest because it is too religious, I believe was the claim. But this is a Mayan poem, and it's called Tu eres mi otro yo. And the poem reads as follows. I'll start in Spanish and I will do the English interpretation following. Tu eres mi otro yo. Si te hago daño a ti, me hago daño a mí mismo. Si te amo y respeto, me amo y respeto yo. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. And so I start to think about this stuff. You know, I'm a researcher, so I have a lot of time to. A lot of people think I just sit around all day and like read books because that's what happens to be in my background. But I do read books, but I also do a lot of research, and I'm also a professor, so I teach a bit. And for me, as I make sense of Tu eres mi otro yo, I'm often reminded of this term in Lakesh, but also around, I'm reminded of our inextricable boundedness to each other. The ways that we are because we are. I am because you are. And so I started I'm holding on to in Lakesh. And then I started to go on this journey around who else is sending me these sorts of reminders? What other places in the world are sending me these sort of reminders? And I was reminded, no pun intended, of the work that Dr. King did when he was incarcerated in a jail for organizing in the South, right? Organizing with other people in the South. And often around food, and in this particular case was around a number of issues, which included food, the right to farm, actually. And he said this when he was locked up in this jail in Birmingham. He said, all people, all life is interrelated, right? Whatever happens to one directly affects all indirectly. I can't be what I ought to be unless you are what you ought to be. I learned that, I think, back in middle school sometime. And so I was reminded of that. And then I'm also doing this work. I'm a former science and social studies teacher. So I always tend to look at the natural world too. And so I'm reminded of this concept called symbiosis. And I want to just show y'all a couple images. And if you could share in the chat what you think you see here. So what do y'all see here? Anybody know this species of tree? It is a tree. Any guesses you could share in the chat? It's not birch. These are aspen trees. And it's actually an aspen grove, which is a set of trees growing in an ecosystem. And the interesting thing that trees do is aspens are not the only ones. If you were to think about growing strong, being a strong tree that was going to live for a very long time, would you want your root systems to go deep into the ground, or would you want your root systems to spread out horizontally? And I think science or physics tells us go deep into the ground because you want to be, like if you build a house, you want to go build deep into the ground and build your foundation and build on top of that because it can help when stuff comes. It might shake you or might blow you over. Well, actually, aspen groves, just like oak trees and other species of trees, their root systems grow horizontally. And when they sense storms oftentimes coming, like when Hurricane Katrina started to approach land on the U.S., the southeastern seaboard, the oak trees, as these aspen trees do, they start to grasp onto each other. And so these aspen trees aren't just interested in protecting themselves. they're wired, hardwired. They have these systems of communication in their roots that actually hold on to each other. This picture that you see here is a sea anemone attached to a crab. And I oftentimes ask people, what's happening here? And they are a little confused and they don't know. And actually, what's happening here is sea anemones are creatures, they're bottom feeders. And so they're kind of like suction cups and they feed on the bottom of the ocean. And they move really slow. Crabs can't, like, they don't have back scratchers, so they can't scratch their backs. And the two species need each other. They depend on each other for survival, right? To make it day by day. And as the sea anemone gets a ride from the crab, the sea anemone is also cleaning that crab's shell. It's removing harmful bacteria from that crab's back. The sea anemone has the back of the crab always, and the crab has got the sea anemone's back always. This is symbiosis, but this is just like having each other's backs no matter what. Something that I'm perplexed by because I work in schools, and we oftentimes do the opposite in schools. And I'm asking myself, if King said it, if the Mayans told us, if nature's starting to tell us, why don't we do it? Here's another symbiotic relationship where fish and shrimp are working together to build homes, to protect homes. And then when they sense danger, they all retreat into this home together. I want to move on to an image here. Oops. This is not a flashback to your undergrad in college. This is actually a murmuration, it's called. They are starling birds, and these birds, and sometimes you might have seen these if you're driving in the sunset and you see some birds moving in the distance or practicing what seem to be flight patterns. This murmuration is actually I got your back moment too. And in this murmuration, these birds aren't doing this for our pleasure. They're not artists, unfortunately. They're doing this to conserve their energy and also to share their energy. And so when the murmuration shifts, the birds are actually using physics to move birds who are flapping their wings really hard on the outside of this murmuration, we'll call it, the shape. They move to the center where they could kind of glide. And then the birds who have been in the center move towards the outside, the circumference of the circle, where there's a lot of strength needed to keep that group moving forward. The interesting thing about murmurations is, yes, there are thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of birds in one murmuration, all with different brains, all with different behaviors, but they all come together. They have each other's backs no matter what. Over the past couple of years, I've also been studying the brain pretty deeply. I do a lot of work on trauma and healing, and I've started to learn about what's required. I told you all I work in schools. I've also started to learn what is required to actually activate the neocortex, the learning part of our brain. And so you look at the slide or you look at my head, doesn't really matter. I promise they're not the same picture here. So when information gets to us, right now you all are hearing me speak. You might see my hands flailing in front of you. You might be looking at this image on the screen. They're sending signals to your brain. The first stop in our brains is our brainstem. Our brainstem asks us a simple question: am I safe? If we're not safe, what happens? What do? Do we sit there or do we fight or flight? Right? If we're not safe, fight or flight. If we're safe, information goes into the midbrain, where our limbic system is, where our processing systems are, and this is where we can make relationships between things. We ask a question here: am I connected to this information? If we're not connected to the information, if we don't feel safe, fight or flight. Finally, if information gets past that safety mechanism, if it gets past the relational mechanism, it gets into our neocortex, the front area of the brain here. And this is where learning happens. And so as a person who works in schools, those of you all who are working to support learning in any situation, whether that is teaching somebody how to grow a seed, or thinking about the scientific content of nitrate in our soil, or thinking about how we can work together to provide communities with fresh foods, or how we can work together to organize against food deserts and what something in my area is school deserts now, right? all requires us to get to the neocortex. But we can't get there without safety, and we can't get there without relationships. The number one variable, you all, to healthy brain development is not the food you eat. It is not the school you go to. It is actually the caring relationships wrapped around us. And so science tells us this stuff. Brain science tells us this stuff. The world tells us this stuff. Indigeneity tells us this stuff. And so I'm left with the question of like, what then prevents us, human beings, who are hardwired in some cases, some might argue, in our DNA, in who we are, in our ethos? We are wired to be connected. So then why are we so disconnected in this world? And for me, this image somewhat summarizes the term that my dear sister, rest in peace, Bell Hooks would offer us. This term, this complex term called white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. But at the end of the day, Bell Hooks and other scholars have argued that there are systems and structures that exist in the world. Sometimes we can't see them. Sometimes they've been formed for 400, 500, 2,000, 20 years. Maybe they just happened last night. But there are systems and structures that create the spaces that we move through. And scholars would, like Bell Hooks and myself, would argue and push us, call us in to not so much blame people for the conditions that they are in or the outcomes of their navigation of those conditions, but really look at the systems and structures. And in my case, that's looking at systems and structures of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. Right? White supremacy, not a Donald Trump, right? Not one person, not the racist, but a system that creates ecosystems for people to divide each other based on social constructions. Capitalism as a system that awards some and takes away from others, as a system that requires people to work for the capital accumulation of a few. It requires people to be in poverty so a few people can be rich. And finally, a system we never like to talk about, patriarchy, right? How I, as a cisgendered heterosexual male, have unearned power. I get invited to speak. I may be in my sort of position of power in the university because of this unearned power, right? And so for me, I want to call us into these systems of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy as maybe some contours, as maybe some boundaries that help us to actually forget our interconnectedness. They help remind us that we're in a system of competition, that it doesn't matter if your neighbor doesn't have sugar. I don't drink milk anymore. Or if they don't have almond milk, or if you're on oat milk, that doesn't matter. It just matters if you have some in your fridge. And I think we have seen over time what these systems have created for us. We live in a world, I'll give you a few facts about Chicago. We live in a space where it is impossible to live on the average hourly wage of most people of color in this city. Last statistic I read was you need to make a wage of $75,000 a year to afford to live on your own. Who makes that sort of wage? And what does that mean about the changing demographics and changing landscape of who is allowed here and who is not? We live in a city where at any given moment, upwards of hundreds of thousands of people could be kicked out of their homes. It's cold outside, and we got folks unhoused. We live in a city and a world, in fact, where men can go on radio, on TV, on camera, on podcasts, and degrade our sisters. All these things help separate us. They don't help connect us. And so for me, this is some indication that we have to get towards healing from this. And I'm not talking about a healing from adverse childhood experiences. I'm not talking about a healing from growing up, for example, with in a household that had physical violence. I'm not talking about healing necessarily from the outcomes of system of oppression. I'm talking about healing from the systems of oppression that continuously harm us, that continuously build ecosystems, or what I oftentimes refer to as containers that we all operate in. And those containers are harmful and they require some healing. And it's much more than take care of yourself. It's much more than an email from an executive director saying, everybody, make sure you go take a bubble bath tonight. It's more than bringing in a professional development session that is mandatory for people to attend on taking care of yourself. It's not unlimited PTO. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that abolishes, gets rid of, or it moves us toward the abolition of systems and structures that cause pain and harm in our lives, right? Building and reconstructing systems. This is what a lot of people don't get about abolition. They're like, a lot of people misread abolition and think it's just burn it all down. No, it's not. It's burn it down, but it's rebuild it up too. At the same time, it's not a linear process of, oh, we got to get rid of it before we can rebuild. It actually happens at the same time, right? And so the abolition I'm talking about is getting rid of the systems that have continuously plagued this land we call Turtle Island, that have continuously harmed BIPOC folks, that have continuously harmed queer, trans, and gender nonconforming folks, that have continuously harmed women, that have continuously harmed non-able-bodied folks, right? I think we can see how these systems divide us. Abolition might help us create new systems that help unite us, that help us, like those sea anemone and the crabs and the round goby fish and the shrimp and the aspen groves, have each other's backs no matter what. What does it mean for us to have each other's backs no matter what? What does this mean for us to move in a world where we can depend on each other? Not just for capital, but for love, for care, for compassion, for a shoulder to cry on, for a chair to be joyous in. As the young bloods would say, a speaker to turn up with, right? Those are the sorts of conditions that I think can help heal us, can help repair the harm that's been caused from outcomes of these structures of oppression I mentioned earlier, right? Can help move us into a direction where we can actually, as I've been repeating throughout the session, have each other's backs no matter what. What does it mean to abolish the conditions that incarcerate us? And that's not just in jails, y'all. What does it mean to abolish the conditions that separate us, that individualize us, that create competition amongst us, that give some of us some and a lot of us none? Right? What does that all mean? And what does that mean for the work that we might do to heal from these spaces? Right? And so somebody who I have learned a lot from, Sean Ginwright, is a professor at University of San Francisco and writes a lot about, a while ago was talking about trauma-informed work in society and in schools in particular, but has since moved towards starting to articulate this concept of healing, being healing-centered. And what Sean Ginwright says is, we need an approach that allows people, that allows us as practitioners or teachers or educators or gardeners or farmers, or just as human beings, to approach trauma with a fresh lens that promotes a holistic view of healing from traumatic experiences and environments. He calls this approach healing-centered. as opposed to trauma-informed. As trauma-informed might be an add-on, healing-centered centers and says all is healing. Not some is healing, not the opening check-in as healing, not the closing circle as healing, but all of our interactions with ourselves and with each other and with the world as healing-centered. Placing healing at the center of our interactions with self, our interpersonal interactions with others, and the sort of institutional and structural interactions we have with institutions and structures in the world. Right? What does it mean to engage in those various spaces, whether they're reflective with ourselves, with others, or making meaning of the world around us in ways that center our well-being, that center our healing? And so I want to get into that a little bit. And so Sean Ginwright calls us in and says healing-centered engagement is 4 characteristics, right? Moving from trauma-informed awareness, some people have said, towards centering healing. Ginwright says, is a political endeavor. It is structural at its core. It is not an attempt to pathologize as Western medicine does. You know, like you go to the doctor looks at you, and what do doctors do? They say, what's wrong with you? What is wrong with you? And then they write you a prescription to try to fix you. Well, healing-centered engagement is not a process that is identifying what's wrong with people and what needs to be fixed in people. It is a political process that asks us what is wrong with the systems and structures we operate within, that maintain the container that we operate in. And what can we do about those things, as opposed to what can we do to fix people? How do we repair the systems? How do we restore humanity? How do we restore the relationality that our brains require for us to learn and transform? Right? So healing-centered engagement is political. Healing-centered engagement is also restorative. Ginwright says that healing-centered engagement embraces a holistic view of well-being. It's not just focused on body wellness. It's not just focused on mental wellness. It's not just focused on spiritual wellness. It is focused on all aspects of our identities, socially constructed or not. It is attending to all parts of who we are and how we experience the world. It's not a fixing, it's a restoration. Because humans are humans. Like I said, it's hardwired in our DNA to care for each other, to love one another, to ask questions about our place in the world and to do something about it. Have you ever seen a crying baby when they exit the mother's womb? Have you ever been around a preschooler? Have you ever been around a 5-year-old? My partner teaches kindergarten. And so I'm always perplexed by the questions young bloods will ask you. And my partner's last name is Rivera. So they say, Ms. Rivera, why is, and they will ask you some super deep, complex stuff. That's age 5. What happens at age 8? What happens at age 15? What happens at age 20? What happens when you get to 38, when you're my age? What happens when you're older? What gets taken from us? And what might need to be restored in us? How do we go back to the joys of being a 5-year-old? How do we go back to the moments we had maybe in childhood that helped us to heal, helped us to be safe, helped us to feel relational and cared for, helped us to learn? That's a restorative process. That's not fixing. That's not an additive process. It's a restorative process. We have everything we need. And we don't need to be fixed. We do need restoration. Ginwright argues that healing-centered engagement is also asset-based. It starts with people's strengths. It starts with our wisdom. It starts with our beauty. It starts with our brilliance, not what's wrong with us. It doesn't start with our pain. It does not start with our trauma. You know, I do a lot of work with students. I was going to say young bloods, but they're not young. I don't think they're adults in college. I've worked with graduate students, undergraduate students, people getting doctorates. I've worked with fifth graders. I work with kindergartners. And I think at all moments along that interactive sort of cycle, it's real easy for us to point out flaws because the world tells us what exists as perfection. And then the world tells us what it doesn't exist as perfection. What exists as other. What exists as not beauty. What exists as not brilliant. What exists as incapable. What needs to be excluded? What needs to be thrown away? What should then, as a result, be disposed of? Right? And so how do we start our processes, our interactions with ourselves, with each other? If we're centering healing, those start with our strengths. Those start with our historical strengths, what's in our DNA, what's hardwired in us. But it also starts with the strengths we have embedded in us to navigate the complexities of the world around us today. Tara Yoso talks about community and cultural wealth, and they argue that all human beings, regardless of the ecosystems they're in, have all sorts of capital. They got social capital. They have navigational capital, linguistic capital, resistant capital, social capital. I think I might have said that. And there are several other forms. Sorry, if you quiz me, I might get the quiz wrong. But essentially, Tara Yoso says that it's our responsibility to tap into each other's capital. And Jen Wright's arguing the same thing. It's our responsibility to tap into each other's strengths, into our assets. Maybe healing, maybe centering healing happens by tapping into our assets, our strengths, our beauty, our brilliance. Finally, Jen Wright says, and this is where I pick up, that healing-centered engagement is feeling for us too. I think those of us who might, be in positions where we work with other people, where we interact with other people, where we're in service-related industries or human services-related industries, we oftentimes position ourselves and we're positioned to pour into everybody else except ourselves. How many of y'all are exhausted? Make sure you can see my hand. How many of you are burnt out? How many of us are trying to figure out how we're going to get through tomorrow? How many of you woke up on Monday feeling like it was Friday? Unlimited PTO does little to navigate that, to do something about that. And so centering healing might actually turn our windows that we oftentimes project onto the world into mirrors to reflect on our own selves, to reflect on our own tanks, to reflect on our own capacities, to reflect on what we might need, right? And so I kind of take all of that, the work that I've learned from nature, the work I've learned from indigeneity, the lessons I've learned from my own experiences in the world, and I'm arriving at this point where I'm trying to think about not only healing, centering healing in the work that I do with other people to pour into them, but actually the work that we do to pour into each other as a collective mechanism of care. Not a hierarchical one, not one bound in power and separation and individuality, not one bound in capital and buying stuff or paying for stuff, and damn sure not one built on my own unearned power as a cis heterosexual male in the world. And so I've started to think about and trying to actualize, and I want to get into this in the last 10 minutes we have together, around what does it mean to engage in collective care? We know that the world is harmful. We feel it. We're burnt out. We're tired. We're upset. We might be grieving. We may be hurt. We may be harmed. But we still have the capacity to transform the world. And I was in a session, a professional learning session. We're building this conference, actually. And I was in Minneapolis. This was probably about 6 years ago. And we ended our session by saying over and over this mantra: I love you. I got your back. We're in this together. And for me, that's the sort of direction that I hope centering healing in our work is, Paulo Freire would say, in our praxis, in our reflection and our action in the world. If we can move towards healing it's also meaning that we're moving away from the individual analysis or being and making in the world towards a collective analysis and collective action, so that we can really embody and actualize what it means to not only say, but practice. I love you. I got your back. We're in this together. We might be different. We might be from different blocks, different families, different cultures, different positionalities, different belief systems. We all in this together. We are all on the same hill climbing, y'all. And if we don't watch out, we all gonna get toppled over by a boulder, and we're gonna be back at the bottom of the hill together. Either way, we're in it together. And so I've started to think about this concept called healing-centered collective care. And so in the various spaces I've been in, I'm a former middle school teacher. I'm a teacher trainer now. I'm a former school leader before this. In all of those spaces, I've started to really think about, what does it mean to be a quote unquote leader? But also, what does it mean to be in this work with other people and to really embody this collaborative sense? Because I've seen too many people that look like me in spaces where I operate in, unfortunately, leave this earth early, leave their lives early, leave their families, their relationships early, because of the martyrdom that we take on by doing things by ourselves, by trying to transform the toxicities of the spaces in our lives, of the places in our lives, by ourselves. And so I'm starting to think and actualize again, what does it mean to be healing centered? And what does it mean for us to be caring for each other as people who are oftentimes positioned to pour into other people? What does it mean for us to actually fill our own cups? Because I imagine a lot of us here at this conference consider ourselves caregivers, not in the health professional sense, but like in the life-giving sense, that we're here because we care about ourselves, we care about other people, we care about humanity, and we care about the preservation of humanity. That's healing centered. That might be some aspirations towards healing centered collective care. And so I'll just share as we start to conclude what I mean by healing centered collective care. And for me, and I also want to just lift up the co-author of this study that helped produce this. And you can read this. I put a link. I think there's a link available in the agenda, or you can download this article. The title is, I can put the title in the chat. And if somebody could share the title in the chat for me with everybody here. Sorry, y'all. This one also has a hostile times in it. It's the title of the article is All I Want to Say Is That They Don't Really Care About Us. Centering Collective Care in Hostile Times. And so for me and the co-author, there are 4 aspects of healing centered collective care, which has come out of our work with other people, right? And the first of those is this concept of fugitivity. We cannot expect the world, which is really good at reproducing structures of hostility, to then just out of thin air create spaces or structures that do something different. I think we should just expect the world, the human world, actually, the white supremacist capitalist patriarchal world, to engage in harmful structures and to maintain those harmful structures and to actually shift those harmful structures given the moments we're in. And so sometimes we got to close the door. Sometimes we have to call it a meeting. Sometimes we have to put something on our calendar. Sometimes we got to engage in this act of fugitivity. Sometimes our stuff doesn't have to be so visible. Sometimes it could be hidden underneath in the undercommons, as Fred Moten would say. How can we practice things in secrecy sometimes that are necessary for our survival and our thrival in the world? How might we gather with each other? And if the institutions that we're a part of don't allow for that, how do we demand it? How do we take that? How do we make that? And for me, that's in our co-author, that's a practice of fugitivity, a renunciation of the terms imposed on us that limit us. It's also thinking about how we can come together and not just do. How do we also fulfill ourselves? How do we fill our cup? And sometimes that's mediated by food, a tradition in my culture, certainly, and a tradition in many of our cultures. How might we come together around food, around breaking bread together as an act of caring for each other? How might we be intentional about pausing the things that are going on in our lives to break bread together? In the fast-paced world we live in today, and I'm not talking about a nuclear family here, y'all. What I am talking about is building with each other and pausing. And sometimes that can happen if we can pause and do so with some food. Or what are other forms of food? Breaking bread might not necessarily mean food together, but it might mean understanding the past and present conditions that will transform and make the future better. For us, Healing Center Collective Care was also engaging in political education. It was studying. It's studying together. It's making sense of the world together. It's identifying those structures of harm together that are oftentimes seemingly invisible to us, that we might not be able to observe so easily. Right? It's building and learning together. And we can't do that unless we're safe and we're with each other, right? And so political education becomes a vital component to this thing around collective care, in particular Healing Center Collective Care. And finally, for us, Healing Center Collective Care is actually engaging in the sort of healing practices that we read about, that we advocate for, that we do with young people, in my case, in school spaces. Y'all might do that in your programming. But do we oftentimes do that with ourselves? How often before you start a meeting do y'all check in with each other? What sort of spaces in this conference are actually embodying healing practices? Right? How do we disrupt the white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal reproductions of life that we are so intertwined in? And sometimes that's being pragmatic in our actions, right? And naming the sort of collective practices that we want to do together. That might mean mutual aid. That might mean check-ins, check-outs, might mean regulatory practices with each other. That might mean not you go home and take a bubble bath email, but a sort of collective pausing of the reproductions of whiteness that exists in our lives. And so maybe that means your workplace pushes pause for a moment. Maybe your workplace doesn't utilize so many pain narratives to solicit money for grants. Maybe that means your institution or your workplace takes a good look at the sort of systems and structures that push people out and thinking about replacing those, abolishing those with systems and structures that actually center our care, that center healing, that engage in practices, not at the start, at the end of the day, not at lunchtime, but at all moments in our interactions with each other and with ourselves. And so for us, you know, it is a both and sort of situation. It's not just until there are butterflies, unicorns, and rainbows we got to engage in collective care. It's not just until there exists a world where we are free of harm. It's actually when we get to that point, we still have to engage in care for each other. We still gonna have to engage in a centering of healing. Because the thing is not as if the things will be absent. They will re-emerge. They will show their heads and faces and tails and feet. And they will demonstrate the mechanisms. They might change over time. They will be in the undercurrents. And I think what Healing Center Collective Care might help us to do is not just actualize the conditions. Not just actualize the conditions, but dream them up. And once we have them, maintain them and shift them to be prepared for the things that influence us. And so I just want to conclude by saying thank you. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that this presentation was fruitful for you. I would love to hear from y'all. If you have any other questions for me, comments, you want to just rap about this, you want to learn more, you want to read the paper, you didn't get the link, hit me up. My email is here. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. So if there was something from this presentation that you'd love to share in that space, I encourage you to do so as well. But I just want to end by saying thank you, appreciate you, and thank you for being in community with me this afternoon. I'm happy to take or address any questions in the last 2 minutes we're here together. Sorry I didn't save more time to do so. Cool. Well, just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Appreciate y'all. Y'all made it to the last session, and this is amazing. So we still have another minute left. I'm trying to fill some space and give you a little more time to ask a question or offer those comments. Yes. Okay, good people. Well, y'all be cool. I will see you all in the future. And please, please don't hesitate to reach out if I could be of any support to you.